Hello, I'm Professor Richard Toye. I'm Director of the Centre of Imperial and Global History at the University of Exeter, and with me is my colleague Dr. David Thackeray. And we are speaking today on a very dramatic day. Not only has Britain voted to leave the EU, but also David Cameron has resigned as Prime Minister. And in a crisis such as this, people always turn immediately to historians to ask what's going on, and so we're here to try and explain it to you in just a few minutes. And well, you know, if we look back, David, to previous such episodes, I mean, I think we are looking at, there's speculation about what the nature of a split in the Conservative Party might be, but let's consider previous splits. I mean, I would argue that the big ones that we want to be thinking about are 1846, 1903 and 1922.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, 1846 split was unusual, given that there wasn't really a clearly defined concept of what the Conservative Party was at the time. But again, with 1846 and 1903, they're both very ideologically based. They're based around clear divisions in terms of economic policy.
So just to recapitulate for people who aren't particularly familiar with the period, 1846 was when Robert Peel, as Prime Minister, succeeded in repealing the Corn Laws, sort of a big move towards free trade, but was then kind of overthrown by his own party, leading to this kind of 20-year split, which really put the Conservative Party out of commission for a long time. In 1903, again, at the point where the Conservative Party was in office, Joseph Chamberlain, who was in fact a Liberal Unionist rather than a Conservative, led this charge, this campaign for so-called tariff reform, again for protection. So here we've got two splits which were very definitely around free trade versus protection, really. What about 1922?
Yeah, 1922, there's less clear divisions. In some ways, 1922 could be seen as a revolt against the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who was a member of the Liberal Party but led a coalition which was dominated by Conservatives. And although it's in response to pressure on Conservatives to end their support for the coalition, in some ways it's a backbench revolt in many ways that we see happening.
Yes, and in a sense the nature of the party has changed, of course, over time. On the one hand, as you say, the 19th century party, the lines of where the party sort of started and stopped very much less clear. It wasn't a mass membership organisation. No. You couldn't sort of send off your money and get your party card in return. Of course, that changes sort of over the course of sort of through the 20th century, really, until we're in a situation where who the leader of the party isn't going to be determined purely by MPs. It is going to be determined by ordinary men and women in Conservative Party associations, individual members around the country, and that creates a different dynamic from the past.
Yeah, and it's slightly ironic in some ways, given that we've seen the decline of mass membership parties, well, certainly since 1950s and 1960s, but their importance in terms of the electoral processes has changed. But I think what's unprecedented about this as well is we've never seen a Prime Minister who has resigned directly in response to the result of a referendum, which adds a completely new dynamic.
Right, because this is the first we've only had. This is only the third UK-wide referendum. We got 1975 on the EEC, of course. Then we had the one over proportional representation or electoral reform in 2011, and the government won both of those quite convincingly. So no problem for Harold Wilson in 1975, or indeed for David Cameron in 2011. So this is an unprecedented situation. Well, how, if at all, does that change things? Well, I mean, the real question is what happens next. I mean, the other thing that is unprecedented is that now there's this process of renegotiation that has been triggered, which some people, even on the Leave side, have said might last until 2020. And what happens in the meantime? And what if somebody wants to call? What if the new Prime Minister wants to call a general election? Will they be able to do that in view of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which was introduced under the previous government, the coalition, which doesn't make it completely impossible to have a general election in between sort of the regular 5-year intervals, but certainly makes it considerably more difficult. And so nobody knows how this works. Nobody's ever tried it. So we could be going into real unknown ground here, which actually historical precedents do not give us a very good guide.
I mean, in some ways, as you say, there's going to be a lot of debate about what Britain's relationship with Europe is going to be. Interestingly, we have the precedent of a British membership of EFTA before it joined the EEC in 1973. Ironically, part of the reason EFTA developed was because of Britain's problems in terms of actually gaining membership to the EEC because of Charles de Gaulle's opposition to British entry. But there's going to be this huge renegotiation of what Britain's relationship with Europe is going to be, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that is organised.
All right, now this leads us to our final point, really, in the sense we know there's this ideological division in the Conservative Party. What is that really about? Now, on the surface, and of course it's very much a question that it is about Britain's relationship with the EU and with Europe, but in a sense, why does that touch such a nerve? Why does that throw open so much bitterness, so much wrangling, which has afflicted the Conservative Party actually for decades now, on and off, with the leaders sometimes managing this more successfully than other times. It's not a straightforward free trade versus protection argument, right?
No.
So in a sense, is my question to you: what is really going on here? Why is this an issue? Which let's say, for example, people don't like the EU. Okay, it's a supranational body which has control over, to a degree, over what happens in this country. But then, so is the IMF, so is the World Trade Organization, so is the UN to a degree. So, what is it about Europe that has made this so toxic for the Conservative Party?
Well, I think there's a much bigger question here of Britain's place in the world, and what we've seen for much of the first half of the 20th century is the British Commonwealth being a very important player in terms of world affairs. And I think Britain's always been, well, particularly elements within the Conservative Party, always been uncomfortable with the perhaps marginal position that Britain has played within the wider European project. So I mean, as you say, there is this long-term tradition of Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party, which has long historical roots about Britain's experience of relative decline, I think we could say, in the world, and what its response should be to that.
And then this is a very final thought. I mean, what we see in the referendum result are apparently very clear class divisions, also very clear geographical divisions. But in a sense, those are not the same geographical divisions that one might well have expected. Looking back 100 or 120 years to the Victorian electoral map, where you had kind of the radical Celtic fringe. We see elements of that still today, but of course, the Republic of Ireland is no longer part of the United Kingdom as it was in Victorian times, so that has changed. Northern Ireland has a very sort of specific place. Wales has voted to leave, Scotland has voted to remain, London has voted to remain, and so here we have this is clearly part of a story about what people call the breakup of Britain, which doesn't seem today an implausible thing to be talking about, which has been going on at least since the general election of 1974, when the SNP made their major breakthrough. Yeah,
and I mean, even if we look at 1975, there's huge differences in the referendum map now compared to then, when Scotland was the most Eurosceptic area of Britain. So there is this fluidity in terms of the electoral map historically, and I think it'd be wrong to assume that the current position is going to be fixed and is going to necessarily dictate the long-term development of Britain's relations with Europe. So I think there's a lot to ponder there, certainly. going forward over the next few months.
And indeed possibly years. David
Yes.
Thackeray, thank you very much.